back to the channel, guys. So today we've got a really good episode for you. It's episode 3 in our Ultimate Track Daily MK8 Golf R series. Today we're going to be installing the Racingline R600 intake along with their turbo inlet kit as well as their coolant underhose. So stay tuned and we'll get right to it. All right, so we've got all the parts taken out of the boxes and I'm just going to walk you through this. So the first thing here we have is the coolant underhose, and it does have a one-way check valve in there, as I mentioned. You can probably see that there. That prevents the fluid from flowing back in the opposite direction from its flow. It does come with both clamps, which is nice. It's a molded hose. It's pretty well constructed. The next bit of kit here is the turbo inlet kit. So what we've got is a nicely made silicone hose. It's very well built. It's got these reliefs so that your filter can fit snug, and then the same thing on the other side for the turbo elbow. The diverter valve has this bung that's been sort of molded into it, and then there's this adapter. The adapter has these different clip points where the diverter valve clips will kind of clip in place. And that is a hard line. Inside the car, there's a hard line that is not really movable all that much. It doesn't have a lot of play. So what we'll do is we'll get this lubed up with some silicone grease, get it in there, get the clamp on it, but we won't tighten the clamp. And then as we're putting it in the car, we'll be able to pivot this to kind of match up with those clamps. And then obviously you've got the turbo elbow with a nice brand new O-ring. This is an aluminum piece. It's pretty nice, substantially larger than the OEM. And then some clamps and stuff that we're gonna need to assemble that. And then over here, we've got the intake itself. So you've got the box, and the box has these holes. We're gonna put those different bushings in there, and those grommets will basically go in there. So when the box sets down inside its mount, we won't get any air bypass in these large holes. You got the cover, we've got the hardware kit, and then the cotton filter. And what's important to know about this is that you can buy this kit with 2 different filters. You can buy it with this cotton filter, or you can buy it with a foam filter. Obviously, the foam filter is made for higher flow, but because we're going to be driving this in daily driving conditions inside the city, we just want something that's going to capture a lot of dirt. It is a high flow filter, and we will probably buy the foam filter for race days, and what we would likely do is it's an easy swap. You just take it out. We'll probably run the box open during race days, so no cover, and we'll run the foam filter, and that way there we can kind of swap it back and forth. All right, so the first thing that the instructions say is to take these 2 T20s and get those removed. We've loosened them up for the interest of time, so we're going to take those out. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to get this clamp undone. There is a tool for this that, if you're doing these on a regular basis, probably makes a lot of sense to invest in. I don't have that tool, so we're just going to use a set of needle nose pliers. We're going to take that and we're just going to let it rest on the inlet itself. So to get that undone, and then the next thing is for us to go and disconnect from these 2 mounts this coolant overhose that is tied into the intake box. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're first going to remove this little vacuum line, and if it doesn't come out, ours was having a hard time out, just get yourself a small little screwdriver and kind of give it a little pry and then pull, and it will come out. We're also going to remove the airbox. So these are just held in with these like interference fit clips, so you just pop them down on both sides, and that frees this whole unit up. Make sure this is off, and then we're also going to take the turbo inlet hose off of the intake. And then once all of that is done, you should be able to just pull up on this and lift the entire unit out. You're gonna have to give it a good tug. There's some grommets down there and they're in tight. So just make sure you give it a good tug and pull it straight up. And you'll see it starts to relieve. And then once you have that, you should be able to kind of wiggle it out and get it to the point where you can remove it from the airbox. The airbox should come out first. Get that out. There's a tight fit. And it will come off once you get it out. All right, so now that's out. Now the box should come straight up. It does sort of come up towards you. And it should come straight up and out. Okay, so with the hose clamp on the back side of the turbo inlet where it meets the turbo elbow, with that loose, you should be able to just pull up on this guy gently and pull this hose right out. Make sure you don't drop the clamp down inside. but it should come right out. And what you will see is that that diverter valve is clamped onto there, and it's just a simple clip. This is that diverter clamp, and there is a clip here that they say if you remove this, you'll get better access to this diverter clamp. And it is a hard line from basically this entire piece. To get a little bit of play in this, we're probably going to undo this clip, and that'll give us a little bit of play, just a tiny bit, for us to get the new silicone turbo inlet in there so that we can get that in there and get it connected to the new elbow. Okay, so I'm going to try to zoom in here a little bit so you can see this. So now with that clamp undone, you can see that you have quite a bit more play in the diverter valve tube, right? And very important that you don't break these clips coming out. They're very flimsy and they can actually break pretty easily. All right, so a little trick that we can do, I've got these hoses loosened up a little bit, is on one side, I just put a stopper in here. This is a smooth stopper. I didn't want to use a bolt because it was going to have a lot of threads and maybe deteriorate the inside of that thing. But this allows me to now take this unit off, kind of absorbing the little bit of water that's going to come out, of course, and then put this back on. And that way there, I now have the ability to raise this up, and I'm not going to get a lot of water leakage. And then we've got the clamp that can go up and on top of this. And then we'll do the same thing for the bottom. We'll get this out, and then as soon as we're ready to rock, we will put that one in. That hose is now in there, so the intake can go over the top of that, and we'll put those clamps on and get them clamped up. But we did not get a lot of leakage in there. We were able to do that relatively quickly, and so that saved us from having to have a pan underneath and have all that drainage go through. So obviously, before you do anything with this turbo elbow, you want to do the same thing we've been doing, which is to just give it a little bit of silicone lube, a good coating of it all the way around, so that you've got a good fit, so that there's no damage that's going to happen to that O-ring as it goes inside that fitting. All right, so the bolts that are down inside there are a set of T30 Torx, so we're going to get those and try to get those loose and get them out of there.
A few moments later.
All right, so we were able to get the turbo inlet elbow from Racingline installed. We took the stock one out. We basically found out that the bottom hole on the Racingline, while it's slotted, the OEM is not. So you have to take both bolts out. Do yourself a favor. If you don't have one of these, get yourself a 3.5-inch extension with your T30 with a small 1/4 inch, and also use a swivel. You're not going to need the swivel on the top necessarily, but on the bottom you're probably going to need it to get around some of the interference that's in there, because you got a lot of parts in there, especially this motor, kind of like in the way and preventing you from getting access to that bottom bolt. All right, so the next step is for us to try to get the turbo inlet tube installed. Remember, we had some assembly lube on this, right? And it's dried out since we put it in there. So I'm probably going to put a little bit more in there just so we can swivel this a little bit better and just make sure it's going to move back and forth, because I do not want to be in a situation where this fixed pipe for the diverter valve is not lining up with these clips. That's going to be really difficult. So the thing to remember about this is you can see Racingline insignias are always on the top, right? So as you're figuring out how this is going to go in, you've got to remember that when you're done, that Racingline insignia is going to be straight up and down, just like all these other pipes and the Racingline insignia that's on the back of the turbo inlet. So if you follow that, it should be simple enough for you to kind of wedge that in there and get it into the right position. All right, so we have all the clamps on the inlet tube. It's important to kind of keep in mind that you're going to have these things in a good position where they can be accessed and they can be maintained, right? So it's important to kind of pre-position these and make sure that you're not putting them in a spot that you're not going to be able to get access to them. The other thing too is you'll notice that all of these things, including the inlet tube and this diverter valve tube, they have these little extrusions that are on the end. So don't worry about having a little bit of lube on there, because as long as you got the clamp on this side of that, you're going to be able to clamp down tight and it's going to make a nice seal. All right, so one thing I wanted to show here is, again, on this diverter valve, you have these clips where they're supposed to go in, and these guys are supposed to go in and sort of interface, and it has to be lined up. So we've got this lubed up nice and well so we can move it back and forth. And the goal here is to make sure that we also recognize that on here there's a guide. And one of the guides is wide and one of the guides is narrow. The narrow one is on the back and the thick one is on the front. So just take your time, and as you go through this, you probably want to just kind of eyeball it to start and just see, are you even close? So this looks like we have to kind of move it and just try to get it into position where when you get ready to go, it's going to just kind of go in there. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we want to try to get the diverter valve tube inserted in here and get that to click in place. So we're just going to push that in place until it clicks. And that's it. It's just a quick click and it's in. And now there should be enough play here for us to move this back and forth as we're wiggling because of that assembly lube. Without that assembly lube, we'd be really putting a lot of stress on this pipe, and we don't want that. All right, so now we should be able to start putting it down into the spot. Be very careful. There is a vacuum line here that is right in the way, and you need to make sure that you do not pinch that vacuum line. So you want to get around that vacuum line because that fitting is easy enough to destroy. All right, and I did have to pivot that vacuum line fitting just slightly out of the way. It does turn, so again, one of those things you want to just be really careful of it. Don't overdo it. If it's not working, don't force it. There's an interference fit here on the end, and it should seat against that little ridge that's on the inside of the pipe. All right, so now that that's in, what we're going to do is we're just going to move that down. And remember that clamp that was holding that diverter pipe? We want to take that clamp. We want to move that clamp back up. So that vacuum line, we did have to pivot that back up counterclockwise. So it came back up in this direction so that it had just enough clearance to go past the tube that is there for the diverter valve. And then that's why that diverter valve insert is so long. So it's definitely clipped in. It's definitely in a good spot. We've got it locked in. That's good. And we've got access to that clamp now. So you can see the clamp there. This clamp, we're going to roll that over a little bit. That's all seated. And then this clamp right here, we've got it so we can access it from the top. All right, and now just finish tightening all those up with, you can basically use either a number 7 metric or 9/32. They'll fit on these clamps. Be sure everything is nice and snug before we start getting to the point where we're at the intake. All right, so once you have that installed and you've got it tight, make sure that you can kind of wiggle it and it's not coming out. You know, the diverter valve is nice and tight and that it's not coming out. Make sure that it's got a good, firm, snug fit before you move on to the next step. All right, so now with that clamp in place, that diverter pipe is not going anywhere. It's going to be nicely supported. Any kind of engine vibration is going to sort of rebound inside the silicone, which is great. I did use a pair of vice grip, those needle nose vice grips, just to close this up nice and snug. And so now we're ready to install the intake. Before we do that, we are going to put some assembly lube on these little mounts, because if we don't do that, it's going to be rubber on rubber and we're going to have some challenges. So we're going to put some on that, and then we're going to put some on the inside of the grommets that we have on the bottom of the intake. All right, and so now we are ready to fit that intake. Pay attention, remember we had this piece here, which is the drain plug, right? And we had to fit that in, and it does not clip in place. It's basically just an interference fit. When you look down inside there, you'll be able to eyeball kind of where that needs to go and how to keep it out of the way of things. So you want to try to get that as close to being where you want it as possible to start. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to slide this guy in place on both sides. Okay, and now that's in place. You should be able to push down until it snaps into those bungs. So that's 1, 2. All right, and when they're done, they're going to look like that. I don't know if you can see that, but they're nice and seated. There is a bit of oil coming through there. We'll wipe that off. That's the assembly lube, but it's down and it's seated, so hopefully this will not come up, but it will come up nice and easy in the future, unlike the stock one, which took a little bit of tugging. Okay, and so before installing the filter, you need to know that, remember that little vacuum line that was on the side that went into the stock intake here? This is a molded hose. There is not enough length for it to reach the filter, as this filter sits down inside the housing. So, and it has to go into this hose. So Racingline does provide these little vacuum lines. So we'll do the same thing we'll kind of lube those guys up and then we'll get that installed. Okay, and so now we loosen up the clamp and we push the filter into the hose. We did put a little assembly lube there as well, just kind of being consistent with how we've been doing this. And it's all the way in. You can feel it kind of seat against the end. And now we should be able to bring that back and seat it right into this chassis. And just make sure it's nice and seated, and then bring your vacuum line up and over and sit your vacuum line on top of the filter. All right, so we now have the cover down. It's nicely seated against the back of the filter, right? So it's going to make that interference fit that it's needed. All the holes are lining up. There is a gap here, but I think that's by design, because if you look at where the flange is for the bottom of the base of the intake, it is all the way forward into this mount. And one thing to note is the original screws were in this forward position, but you cannot, because of the way this interferes with the front here, you cannot move it that far forward. So I did put it into the back hole on both sides. All right, and that's it, completed. I am going to take a little rag, shop rag here, nice clean shop rag, and I'm going to use a little bit of carbon choke cleaner just to kind of clean off on the rag any kind of mess that was left behind by any of that assembly lube. And then we will put the cover back on the engine and we'll fire it up and see how it sounds. All right, so we got it fired up and there's no codes, which is always a good thing. So let's hear what it sounds like. Sounds pretty good. All right, so that's the end of the video. That's a wrap. Hopefully you guys found this useful and found it educational. And if you did, please hit the like button and smash subscribe. And we'll see you on the next one. We have a new video coming up probably in about 2 weeks, which is going to be for the front splitters and side splitters and the rear diffuser from Flow Design. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, I'm going to go take this thing for a ride. Thanks.